Welcome to the next module. Today we'll be talking about survey research, specifically on how to use and create and implement surveys in different types of research and for different purposes. Surveys are used to obviously gather information or even assess individual characteristics for all types of research studies, and almost every research project that I've worked on as a research assistant or that I'm currently working on has at some point used a survey to collect data or information from our participants. Hopefully by the end of today you'll be able to just feel comfortable creating a survey, as this will be your assignment at the end of today, which we'll discuss when we get there, but just keep that in mind as we go throughout today. So just a little outline. First we'll be discussing on developing surveys and specifically finding existing instruments that people have already created for us to be able to use, or if there's nothing that really fits what we're looking for, we'll talk a little bit about developing our own questions and then pilot testing those questions. And then we'll go on to talk about using Qualtrics and mTurk in survey research, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we get to that. So first is how to prepare instruments, and specifically identifying good instruments. But before we get into that, we just wanted to go through some vocabulary just to help us get on the same page. So when we talk about an instrument, we're just referring to any tool that's used to gather data from participants. So this could be a survey, for example. When we talk about a scale or a questionnaire, that just refers to any specific type of instrument within a survey. When we use the word item, that just means any specific question or task within a survey, scale, or questionnaire, for example. And then the last two terms are just reliability and validity. And we'll go over those a little bit more in depth later. But reliability essentially just refers to precision or how consistent our results are. And then validity refers to accuracy, or does it really measure what it's supposed to. And so we use both reliability and validity in evaluating how useful an instrument is, and whether we want to use it for our purposes. So when we talk about selecting instruments, first we just want to talk about using existing instruments when possible. So when there's an instrument out there, for example, to we want to measure someone's ability to forgive situations. If there's already an instrument out there that's been validated and that has been widely used throughout the literature, and it fits kind of our research and what we're wanting to, the information that we're wanting to gather, then we want to use that existing instrument first when possible. People have already done the work to assess the validity and reliability, and so there's no need to do it all over again. In our example situation, where if we're wanting to evaluate say someone's ability to forgive situations, for example, and perhaps there's only instruments that are specifically for evaluating someone's ability to forgive others, then we might want to adapt those questions to kind of fit specifically what we're looking for, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to adapt those questions and kind of the process for that as we move forward. So as far as how to find existing instruments, obviously Google is a widely used a tool for searching and looking up journal citations, or just looking up articles that have already used certain instruments, and specifically Google Scholar for that. Another one is to to look through scholarly journals, and specifically it's often contained in the measures section that we see how other studies have measured a certain construct. So like forgiveness, for example, how other studies have measured it before, and then we can kind of see, hey, maybe there's an instrument that's been used by a lot of people within the literature, and so we want to use that one as well, something that's familiar. Another one that's listed here is the Mental Measurements Yearbook, and this is specifically good for mental health measures, which you'll often be working with in the public health department. And that's available at the Harold B. Lee Library. And in order to find that, you'll just have you can just Google search the Harold B. Lee Library databases, and then you can select the different databases that you want to search, and you'll just have to sign into your BYU account in order to do that. But that's the HBLL is another great resource for finding articles, finding instruments, and doing so by different topics. We'll just go ahead and pause. If you want to go ahead and pause the video, and we're going to go ahead and practice just searching for a scale about family belonging or family connectedness by Google searching, and then go ahead and look through whatever articles you can find and look in the measures section to see if you can find a scale that they use to measure family belonging or family connectedness. So go ahead and pause and practice. Alright, so how do you know if the scale you found is any good? So there are a lot of scales out there, and so it could be hard to know which ones are legit, right? So first you want to review what others have said about it in the peer review literature. So oftentimes there will be articles that will comment on the scales specifically, and you just want to review the scale to see if the questions, match what you're wanting to ask, and this is what we call face validity. So if you're going through the scale and it doesn't really ask questions about what you're trying to evaluate, then it's probably not the right scale. And then lastly, you want to look up scale reliability and validity, and we'll practice that a little bit more, but that is also something that's found within the literature that we can search through Google or the Harold B. Lee Library to be able to just find more articles that have used these scales and more research and see how reliable and valid these scales have been. So like I said earlier, we're going to talk a little bit more about validity and reliability. So in this example, this is a classic example. If you've taken statistics, you've probably seen this before. But in this case, we would consider this, if this is a target with bows and arrows, this would be, a valid but not reliable. And so, in general, if you're to take the average of all the different hits on the board, they would meet in the center, but they're not reliable because they're not consistently in the center. On the flip side, this is a reliable but not valid dartboard or whatever you want to call it, and this is because they're consistently in the same place, but they're not accurate, right? They're not towards the middle where we're wanting to hit. And then of course this is the ideal situation where it's valid and reliable, and so that's what we're really looking for when we're looking for different scales or questionnaires that we want to use in our research. Something that is valid, so it's it's measuring what we want it to measure, and it's reliable. It's consistently measuring what we want to measure. Alright, so validity is, and we kind of talked about this a little bit, but it measures what it's designed to measure. So if we're wanting to assess someone's ability to forgive, it's really actually assessing someone's ability to forgive and not how grateful they are or some other attribute that we're not looking for. So types of validity, we talked about face validity a little bit. Just as you look through the different items or questions, They seem to really be going after what we want. Content validity is just that the measure includes all aspects of the concept of interest. And then construct or criterion validity is just the degree to which a measure correlates with other external measures. So, there may be more than one measure for assessing, somebody's ability to forgive, and so we can compare it to other measures and see if they kind of all are assessing the same thing, and if they're correlated. Reliability can be assessed in a couple ways. We can talk about internal consistency, and this, just is essentially saying, each item is correlated to the scale as a whole. So if we have 7 different questions about, someone's ability to forgive, then each of those questions is kind of getting at somebody's ability to forgive as a whole. And we'll talk about this a little bit more today, but we often use Chromebox Alpha in order to measure that. Another way to assess reliability is through factor analysis, and this just examines how well several items individually and collectively fit with a factor. And so as you go through the literature, you'll often see or hear the words factor loadings and model fit. And we won't go into too much depth about those today, but that's just be aware that that's another way that we assess reliability. So I mentioned Chromebox Alpha as far as evaluating the internal consistency of a survey, and this is probably the most common measure that you'll see throughout the literature. Chromebox Alpha is anywhere from the number will be anywhere from 0 to 1, and the closer to 1 the better. That just shows that there's more internal consistency, which is what we're looking for. And when we are looking for scales, we really want to find scales that have a Chromebox Alpha that's greater than 0.7. And you can see a little chart that we have over here in the bottom right hand corner that just talks a little bit more about how to interpret the Chromebox Alpha number. So when you're looking for Chromebox Alpha, and we'll go ahead and let you practice this, but you'll typically find it in the methods or results section, and it will often be seen, it'll mention the scale. So we used a 10-item scale. We used the 10-item, depression scale, and then right after it talks about that, it'll often have this alpha equals, and then the number in parentheses right after it mentions the scale. So that's just what you can be looking for as you go ahead. And we gave you 2 links here to look through. These are articles that we've found that use Chromebox Alpha, and so go ahead and look through each of those articles and see if you can find the Chromebox Alpha in either the methods or results section. All right, we're also going to practice a little bit more. There's a family resilience scale here in Turkish sample, and you can practice finding the Chromebox Alpha in the results section as well. So just a couple things to keep in mind as you look for research, or as you're looking through the literature. Look for research on scale reliability and populations similar to the one that you're evaluating. So if you're working with children, for example, if you're wanting to use a survey or a questionnaire to evaluate children's ability to forgive, you wouldn't want to be looking at articles that are using that same questionnaire in elderly populations, for example. You just want to make sure that you're evaluating it across similar populations, because some scales may be reliable for one population but not the other. And so, these can be differences here in age or culture, gender, language, literacy level. And obviously you're not going to find the exact same population, but you want to be as similar as possible to really make a good evaluation of whether or not you should be using this scale for your purposes. All right, we're going to go on to just talk about how to prepare instruments, and specifically how to construct good instruments. Maybe this is in the case that we don't have a good scale readily available to us, or we just need to adapt it for our own purposes. So just a few things that go on surveys, and you're probably familiar with this if you've taken surveys for classes or if you've been in research studies before, but oftentimes you'll see demographic variables. So this is questions about age, sex, socioeconomic status, things like that. You'll see awareness variables, you'll see cognitive variables, psychosocial, skill, behavioral, environmental, health, quality of life. So obviously there are a lot of different things that they can evaluate. When it comes to creating a survey instrument, just a couple things to keep in mind. Generally, we want to put sensitive questions at the end of the survey. This because people often skip sensitive questions, and it can be that they sometimes will just quit the survey after seeing a sensitive question. And so obviously it's better for them to quit at the end when we have a lot of usable information as compared to the beginning. When it comes to participant demographics, we usually, in most surveys, you'll see those at the beginning, but sometimes at the end. It just depends on kind of what your personal preference is, but we usually want those at the beginning or end. When it comes to balancing, or when it comes to constructing good questions, we want to balance positive and negative responses to kind of avoid bias in one direction. So, for example, we could ask, like, how often do you eat fast food, and how often do you eat vegetables? And for one person that may be often or not at all, right? And so we don't want a series of 50 questions where the kind of socially acceptable response is always very often, right? Because then they'll just kind of get in the flow of saying very often for every question, right? So we just want to change it up. We want to have some very oftens and some not at all answers, and just kind of be able to avoid bias. It's also important that we define terms. So here's a bad example of a question. Have you or anyone in your household had diarrhea lately? And lately is kind of hard to define, right? So a better example might be, have you or anyone in your household had diarrhea in the past 2 weeks, right? Because then there's a clearly defined time period for them to answer the question. Another tip is just to make sure that categorical responses are exhaustive and mutually exclusive. And so when we talk about exhaustive, we just means that it includes all possibilities. And when we talk about mutually exclusive, we just means that the answers don't overlap. So it's not possible, for someone to answer, both A and B when they're not given that option. And then also just state questions simply and directly to avoid confusion. So for example, does the household own a television? Yes or no? That's not a great example of being clear, because maybe somebody in the household owns a television, and so there could be a little bit confusion there of what you mean when you say household. Another tip is just to ask only one question in any item. So for example, a bad example is, what is the main source of energy for cooking and lighting in your home? And we see here that there's both cooking and lighting, which may have two different sources of energy, right? So that can be hard to answer if you have gas and electricity as answers when they can both be sources. A better question might be what is the main source of energy for lighting in your home, and then having a separate question for what is the main source of energy for cooking in your home. It's important that we also only ask for information that the respondent is likely to have. So for example, teenagers in the home might not know the family's annual salary. They could guess, but you're probably not going to get the best information. And so you'll have to ask instead for their kind of subjective socioeconomic status. So as far as they see it, kind of where would they place themselves? And you just have to know that there's going to be some bias in those answers because they're not as familiar with the answer to that question. It's also important, and this may be a little bit obvious, but I think we can kind of forget sometimes, just to consider your audience when choosing your vocabulary. So you want to ask, adults questions differently than you'll want to ask elementary school children, and it's very possible that you'll work with different populations like that in your research, and so you just want to be cognizant of who you're asking the questions and kind of their vocabulary level. It's also important to be aware of social desirability in items. So we talked about the fast food example and the vegetable question earlier, and just be aware that we all want to we kind of want to fit the model, and so there can be some bias that comes into play when we're asking about questions where people want to be as socially desirable as often as possible, even if they're not realizing it. So for example, people can over-report. So for example, on the vegetable question, how often do you eat vegetables, we might over-report that, so there can be some bias there. And it just depends, we want to ask about the most recent behavior because that's going to be obviously the most accessible information for participants. And so for some questions it might just be that they are hard to admit. It's hard to admit that they never do it, right? And so just be aware of those things as you're creating and analyzing questions and responses. There are also socially undesirable questions. For example, how often do you eat fast food, which respondents may be inclined to underreport. So we can, for example, we can ask about if they've ever engaged in this behavior, and then ask about the current behavior. So, have you ever smoked a cigarette? Versus, in the past 2 weeks, how many cigarettes have you smoked? And so, it can kind of just kind of split up those questions a little bit. All right, we're just going to do a little activity here. Just as we go through here, we just want to find the flaws in some of these questions. So go ahead and just take a few seconds to read through the question and think about what's wrong with it. So in this question, we see that it's not exhaustive. So for example, what is someone that's 38 inches tall? What's their answer going to be? And so we just have to make sure that it's that we get all of the possible answers, even if we have to add other at the end. But in this case, obviously we want to make sure that all the ranges are filled. And then also, this is just kind of a side note, but we use centimeters for answer D and inches for answer C. So we just want to make sure that we're consistent in units and things like that. So for this question, there are a few things. First, it's a little bit confusing. I know I had to read through it a couple times. It's pretty wordy, and then it's also not mutually exclusive. So for example, fruits and vegetables are kind of overlapping here. And so, those may be different answers. And so you have to provide participants with the opportunity to answer that differently because, the price of the item may be different in importance for fruits as it is for vegetables. So for this question, it's very hard to think about how we would categorize our answers to this question, especially if it's just an open, free response type of answer, because it's very likely that we'd get all kinds of different answers, and so we just have to make sure that there are clearly defined categories, and if not, that there would be some way or methodology for categorizing our answers once we go to analyzing the responses. Similar to a question before, this question is not exhaustive, so these 4 answers don't necessarily constitute all the possible answers, and so we would maybe have to put an E and say other. Whoa. Not the best looking other, but you get the point. We would have to put another answer there to be able to effectively be exhaustive in our question responses. And similar with this question, if you just look over it, it's also not exhaustive because maybe I consume peas and apples every minute. And sometimes it's also, hard to define, as well as, my consumption of peas and apples may be different, right? So there are a few things wrong with that question. Something to be aware of, and it's hard because you want to gather as much information as possible, but you also have to be aware of survey fatigue, and so, 100 questions might be a little too much, especially if you're only paying them, $5 or whatever. That can just become a lot to kind of give the same answer over and over again, and that can bias the question responses as well. So the last thing that we wanted to talk about is pilot testing, and so this is just the way that we test our survey among a small number of people in our population. So for example, if we wanted to implement or administer a new survey and our population is going to be BYU students, maybe we just invite or gather a few participants first to just kind of test the survey to help identify problems, it'll help prevent wasted time and money that maybe the answers weren't that usable because we forgot to ask something or we had some bad questions, and then you can gather information about how long did it take to complete, were there any confusing questions or responses, was the order of questions weird or anything missing, and then it also gives you an opportunity to check your responses and see if the information was all gathered correctly and if they're easy to kind of group all of the information that you've gathered in the pilot test. So one way that we create and administer surveys is through Qualtrics, and so some of you might be familiar with Qualtrics, but if you haven't already, we want each of you to create a Qualtrics account because you'll probably, or more than likely, be using Qualtrics throughout your research. So go ahead and pause the video. I've created a list of step-by-step instructions to be able to create a Qualtrics account. And so go ahead and do that now, and then go ahead and resume the video once you've completed that. When it comes to designing Qualtrics surveys, it's really easy to learn for the most part, and pretty intuitive when it comes to using. And a lot of stuff you just have to learn by trying and figuring things out, and there's a lot of answers on Google as well if you can't find out how to do something in particular. But just a few aspects of Qualtrics that you'll become familiar with is that there are different question and answer types that you can change. You can validate responses, so you can make sure that certain responses only have numbers, or you can force a response so that the participant can't continue on to the next page without answering that question. There's skip logic, so for example, if you ask a question about employment, are you employed? If they answer no to that question, then you might not want them to answer the next question if it's asking about how many hours per week they work, because obviously if they're unemployed, they probably don't work. And so that's where skip logic can come in. Creating question blocks, so if you had a few different scales in your survey, one about forgiveness and one about gratitude, you can kind of block those off. And then you can score your answers, so from 0 to 5 or whatever, so that Qualtrics can automatically score each participant's answers, and you can add those up. And then the last tip is just to preview the survey on a computer and a phone if both are going to be used by participants, just to make sure that it's compatible and that everything kind of flows correctly on both platforms. Something that you may also become familiar with as a research assistant is Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which we often shorten as MTurk. And MTurk is really useful just as a way to implement surveys. So it's really just easy to use and frequently used by our team of researchers. And it's simply it's just a platform where there are respondents that can choose to answer your survey. So if we have a Qualtrics survey that we want to administer to 250 people, we can just post it on MTurk, and then usually within half an hour or an hour or so, we'll have all 250 responses. And it's been found that those respondents, those participants, are pretty representative of the general population. And so it's a pretty good resource if you're just wanting to get some maybe preliminary data, or if you're just wanting to kind of gather a lot of information quickly. MTurk is a good way to pay participants a small amount of money to be able to just participate in your survey and answer your questions. And then after they answer those questions, you have the opportunity to kind of review the responses and approve them. And Qualtrics and MTurk are fairly easy to integrate as far as transferring information and data back and forth to be able to use. And so those are both two tools that we use frequently to create and administer surveys in our research. So now on to the assignment for today. All the instructions are here, but essentially you'll be designing a survey. And if you have any questions, go ahead and reach out to your professor. But feel free to go back through our module today to help you to develop your survey and develop good questions.